Advisory Committee to order. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
So move.
Moved by Locks. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Scallon-Taylor. Any discussion? Hearing none, come to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, the agenda is approved. Then we'll move on to the minutes. And in the packet are the minutes from the July 8th meeting. And also in the packet are the presentations that were from the last meeting. So any changes for the minutes? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved by Locks and seconded by Surjamaki to approve the minutes. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, the minutes are approved. We will then move on to item number 4.1, the information and updates. And Kari, are you going to be providing these updates today?
Yes, I will be providing them.
Thank you.
Let's see. Just if you could make me a panelist on the WebEx, and then I will share my presentation. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so for the information and update section this evening, just start off, we'll probably start this off at all of our meetings just to remind everyone where we are and the timeline and deliverables. So we are still on this schedule. And these are the past meetings. This is meeting on our 5th meeting tonight, and we'll be doing some discussion about revenues and property tax and the kind of explanation of different pieces of the property tax levy. Next week we'll be discussing internal service funds. And here's some tentative dates that we discussed last time as well, and I did send out to all the committee members last week kind of the tentative dates. And talking about the engagement plan, Emily Larson has been putting some information together, and also if you remember from last week, the Bang the Table software, putting some things together for that, so we'll have things to share with you soon. We're tentatively looking at some dates in September for some community listening sessions using Zoom. We'd also be using other types of engagement tools, but what we're sort of looking at is in the evening on a Thursday, September 17th from 6:30 to 8, and Saturday, September 19th in the morning from 10 to 10:30. So 2 similar types of listening sessions, but we'll look for some more information on that. And then the one thing I had to follow up from last week, the question was, are there mandates that are handed down from the state to the county or to the local level regarding the public health division? And looking ahead, what might the city's public health division have to undertake that would require more property tax support? So I reached out to the public health division, to Bonnie Paulson, who is the division manager and or public health administrator, and then assistant public health administrator, Nick Kelly. And here's the information that they shared with me. So what they said is that at this time, our mandates for service are based on Minnesota statute, and they're not aware of any unfunded mandates that will impact the 2021 budget. When they're here in August as part of the Community Services Department, you'll have some more detailed information. But what they wanted to share is that Bloomington is a community health board, and it's designated by the Minnesota Department of Health, state statute, and they are mandated to do the activities through the state statute on these. There's 6 areas of responsibility, and they're listed there: maternal, child, and family health, environmental public health, communicable disease control, chronic disease and injury prevention, access to and linkage with clinical care, and public health infrastructure are the 6 areas. And so Hennepin County is their own CHB, as is Edina and Richfield, and Hennepin County does not mandate activities to the city of Bloomington. We are only directed by the Minnesota Department of Health state statute. And just some history is that in the early 60s, the city of Bloomington made the decision to advance their public health division. And in 1976, when the 145A statute was updated, jurisdictions had to decide to become their own CHB or to let it roll to the county. And the decision by Bloomington, Edina, Richfield, and Minneapolis was to become their own CHB. And Bloomington, Edina, and Richfield have been working together on public health since 1977. And we currently are accredited as a 3-city site by the Public Health Accreditation Board, meaning Bloomington, Edina, and Richfield, which is a national accreditation. And so prior to COVID-19 emerging, the state was starting a conversation on how to strengthen local public health, which included possible revisions to Minnesota State Statute 145A. And this report that they provided here's a link to this report if you want to look at that later. And that we had many members of the staff at City of Bloomington Public Health Division participate in the initial conversation with the Minnesota Department of Health on 21st century public health in Minnesota that resulted in an initial framework for what public health may look like in the future. And of course, this work's been put on hold because of COVID-19, but work will restart, but unclear what it will look like and when that will occur. And there will likely be changes to how public health operations in the future based on the lessons that have been learned and broader recognition of the role public health plays in addressing structural racism. So as a nation, public health is moving towards a strategy of public health focusing on cross-sectorial environment, policy and system level action to directly affect the social determinant of health. And this work directly impacts the root causes of health inequities that result from structural racism. So our core direct services will be continuing, but new programming or services will likely be focused on the policy system level work. So that is the update. A lot of information from Public Health Division. So just wanted to share that follow-up from question from last week.
And I just want to check to see if that addressed the question that folks had or if there was anything that we wanted to follow up on that. John?
Mr. Chair, yes, I think I asked the question, and I thought that was very helpful. And obviously, we're going to come back at this in August with the community. So I thought it was really good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other questions on that topic? Car, did you have anything else for us on that?
That was all for this section. And then the next section we'll be getting into, we have an item on revenue analysis and then also on property tags.
Okay. Let's move on then to item number 4.2, the revenue analysis item.
Okay. All right, and so this is on revenue analysis, and you might have noticed we have some additional people up here tonight. So Mark Reichel is a tax and assessing analyst at the City of Bloomington, who's recently become that role. He just recently went to part-time with the city after how many years of being full-time at the city in the assessing department, Mark?
30.
30 years. So we're very happy that he's decided to work still with us on a part-time basis. He is an expert in many areas in the property tax, Minnesota property system and many other areas. So he works a lot with us on evaluating the tax levy impacts and property valuation. And of course, Lori Economy-Scholler, our CFO, is here too. And we're going to be talking about tonight, Mark's going to give some insight into some of the different analysis that we've been doing. We've been part of a team with the lodging and admission taxes and forecasting that. And you'll also notice that we have some easels in the room. So we're all in the room this evening. And to do something a little differently, you should all have Sharpies, I think. Or, you will have, so maybe we want to pass those out now because as we go along. So we'll have Sharpies and then these half sheets of paper that are like they're big Post-it notes, and that as we're going through these different sections, if you want to write down, if you have questions about something or an opinion about a different area that we're talking about, or some clarification or some ideas such as what if we did this, things like that, if we ask you to write those down as we're going through, and then we're going to take a break between this discussion on revenues and then the discussion on the property tax levy. And there's these different things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to have you get up and put your half sheets of paper with the questions or opinions or thoughts or ideas or things you want to know more information about on those on the easels up there, and then we're going to use those for discussion. And if there's things that you want us to follow up on, or we can answer your questions now, or just generate some ideas and just get your opinions on things. Does that make sense how we're going to be doing it this evening? Okay. So Brianna is going around and passing out the Sharpies, and you'll want to write pretty big on these half sheets of paper so that you can see them from where you're sitting. All right. And I should say too, if you have a question, if we're going through something and you just have a question clarifying what we just said, and you want to right then just find out some more information, go ahead, ask questions. But some of the other things, maybe write them as we go, and then we're going to put them up there and then talk about it at the end. All right. So what I have here first is these are the 2020. This is the general fund budgeted revenues. And just showing it to you in a pie chart to kind of get a sense of how large the property tax portion of that is. It's 68%. So of the $79.4 million in the general fund revenue budget, property tax is about $54 million. So 68% of that. And then lodging tax would be the next one. Permits, and then the other ones are shown here. So just to give you a sense of the distribution. And then we had talked about this, I think maybe our first meeting of the Community Budget Advisory Committee. But here is the numbers of the 2020 budget revenues for the general fund and where we are today with some updated numbers of our 2020 projected revenues. So it's going to be hard to know exactly how the property tax will come in until early January. But just from what we're looking at, we think there will be delinquencies, and it could be as much as $6.9 million. So that's what we are still projecting. And you can see the lodging tax, $5 million less than budget. And although in some other areas we're looking at more than budget, like in intergovernmental revenue. So, and a lot of times that will happen if we do have grant revenue or intergovernmental revenue that we don't know about earlier or when the original budget is passed, and then the budget's amended when we receive those, is why that would be higher. But so right now we're looking at a $14 million shortfall in revenues for just this year.
Hey, Kari, can you
Yes.
go back just a second?
Yes, I can.
And one of the things that I've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to make it clear because this is a great way to look at it, is if you look at some of these categories are temporarily unavailable and some of them are permanently unavailable, okay? So a good example is the property tax at $6.9 million. Eventually, the city will collect that. It might be next year, it might be 2 years from now, it might be 3 years from now. I think we'll have a discussion on maybe when that is going to happen, but that money eventually will show up at the city. The lodging tax money, every month that the hotels are closed, that the money that we would have generated from lodging tax, there's not gonna be a month where we have lots extra and that comes back. So it's important to distinguish those two categories here, because some of it is a timing thing. And like in property tax, for example, you might say, well, is there some way can we temporarily shift money around to cover for that? Because we know that that's eventually going to come in the door. That's a tactic that you might take on that, but for something like lodging tax, you might say that that's not an appropriate way to deal with that because that particular month's worth of revenue is not going to come back at some point in the future.
Yes, thank you, Chair Peterson, for pointing that out.
Kari, can I just jump in for a second? I think it's a
course.
really good note that Chair Peterson made, and I just want to explain a little bit further, just in case the members of the committee don't know, but in case there are people watching as well. The reason that the property tax will eventually be collected is that property tax runs with the land. And so even if a property owner, a property taxpayer is delinquent and maybe even goes into foreclosure or into bankruptcy, the taxes will still stay attached to the property itself. And so at whatever point that somebody brings that property back onto or into production, the taxes would then get paid. So it may be somebody else, but that would explain the delay of why it eventually gets collected.
Thank you. And this was also some repeated information from our first meeting, but just to bring this up again, this is just for the 2020 shortfall. And a big point about this slide here is a lot of these, this would just be one-time strategies to address it. So we couldn't use the strategy again in 21. And the order that they are on this slide is kind of the order of the priority. So we've already have had 2.9 million in service reductions, and 700,000 of deferred capital spending, 6.7 million that we can use from the general fund balance reserve. And then if you recall, in our facilities fund, we've been setting money aside for replacement of our pool vessel at Valley View Park, and we could potentially use 4.5 million that's there. And then when it comes time to replace the pool vessel in a few years, issue debt for that instead. And then in our compensated absences fund for paying out accrued vacation and personal time, we could potentially take 1.2 million and bring down that fund from being around 90% funded down to only 80% funded, which would be the lowest we'd want to go. And then $1 million in the strategic priorities fund. So right, that is 17 million on that previous slide. We're looking maybe at 14 million. So if we didn't have to use all of those reserves, that would be good. So this one, we're going to be talking about these different types of revenues. And,
Right.
oh, yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yes.
And Neil, drag the microphone over to where you're at so people can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. There was a couple other categories on that revenue chart that you had that are again, they're gone. The admissions tax, that's just gone. That's not coming back.
Yes.
I guess that's the only other one, like what Steve was talking about in the lodging tax. Then take me back to your comment about you show cuts of 17, or program. You could do program changes for 17 million to help cover this 14 million gap, right?
Right. So we've already done some expense reductions and deferred some capital spending, but we have some fund balance and reserve that, if we needed to, could address the remaining shortfall.
Okay. Then leads me to the question, our job is to look at 21. Any of these strategies, can we carry them over into 21? Are we burning them all up in 20?
So Chair Peterson and committee members, if we do not need all of the 17 million, I think it is an option that the committee could discuss. Since it's an option that we're using for 2020 shortfall, I think it was something that you could discuss as an option. I don't know, Lori or Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
The timing would be difficult because we won't know the property taxes when they come in December, and most of your work will be completed by then. So our second half of taxes are December and early January, and then we're looking at how all the expenditures really landed. So, And if there's anywhere we could offset any of these expenditures with some of the CARES money for costs that we incurred this year, we'll be utilizing some of that too. So it might not be as bad as 17 or as bad as 14. We won't know until January.
Okay, but there will not be a 6.7 million general fund balance reserve available.
That is correct.
Okay.
That 6.7 is a combination of year-end 2019 positive performance and bringing our fund balance from over 40% down to 35%. And that is pretty much the lowest we want to go in regards to how the state auditor regards fund balance. Because when you look at fund balance, had that range because we had another 12% of our revenues in hotel and admissions. With that tanking, we don't have that flexibility with our working capital anymore.
And Chair Peterson, I'd echo what Kari said, that these funds would be available as part of a recommendation if the committee wants to include one-time funds as part of that recommendation. And so that'll be a conversation about whether you want to have a structurally balanced budget or you want some sort of a graduated approach over a couple of years. The other place where these funds are potentially still available for the city to utilize is in a scenario where next year the revenues still don't materialize. So if we budget for certain revenues, whether it's lodging or admissions or somewhere else, and we don't realize the amount of revenue that we budget, then we still have these reserves to plug that gap in 2021.
So this slide is just talking about there's different timing of these receiving these different revenues. So like Lori was saying, we won't know for the property taxes. We only receive them twice a year, around middle of the year and the end of the year. And so we won't have everything collected until January of 21. And historically, close to 99% of the taxes that are levied we collect, but we do not expect to get 99% this year. And it is a timing issue. Whereas lodging and admission taxes, we receive those monthly. And just a note that the performance of that, we don't really have any control over that. It's based on the hospitality economy, and the city has little influence. And permit fees we receive throughout the year, we're not allowed to set the fees higher than the costs for the service, and that fluctuates with the economy and development market. And licensing, the liquor licensing revenues are received annually in late May and early June, and then other types of licenses come in throughout the year. And program income, we receive throughout the year. So primarily in the general fund, that is public health and parks and recreation. And then grant revenue we receive periodically through the year. All right, so the first area we're going to talk about is lodging and admission taxes. And I'm going to turn it over now to Mark Reichel to just talk about the history and some forecast analysis.
Okay, thank you, Kari, and good evening, co-chairs and committee members. Thanks for having me here tonight. As Kari mentioned, one thing we did to try to forecast the impact on lodging and admission is set up this internal working group here in the city from people from various departments. So we have finance, Port Authority, and assessing staff represented, and we met weekly initially, and now it's more of a bi-weekly. But we're doing our best to study this issue, and I think one thing I hear, I'm sure you hear this word spoken all the time, that this is really an unprecedented impact, both from a health standpoint and from a financial standpoint. And I believe that to be true. I've heard it a lot, but as a group, I think the first thing that we thought we should do is to go back and study the history of the data, of the lodging and the admissions, and because we've been through real estate and economy, it's cyclical. And so we're hoping to learn what we can from past cycles. So the chart that you've got up right now is a 19-year history of lodging tax revenue, and starting in 2000 up to 2019. And, you know, it's what it really represents is 3% of lodging sales. So if we were to do this bar chart using lodging sales, it would look identical. But I think it's interesting to go back in time and just see how closely lodging is tied to the economy, just the overall economy, because it really tracks. So if we start in 2000, you can see that we had just come through the late 90s, and the internet technology was all the rage, and there was so much investment in stocks of technology and internet related companies. And we know what happens, things cycle. And so come early 2000, or in that time frame, the bubble burst. And so we start this downward track in the economy, and lodging follows. And then the unspeakable tragedy of September 11th, 2001 occurs, and it just continues this downward trend in the economy as well as the lodging revenues. So you see that, over that 3-year decline, we had about a 19% reduction, and it took a full 6 years back to 2006 to get back there. And then once we got back, we continued growing until the next cyclical issue, which was kind of started by the housing finance market, and that just kind of started a cascading of events that led to just the largest recession or downturn since the Great Depression. And it was not gradual like the early 2000s. It was steep. I mean, it went boom, 18% in 1 year. And but what happened then is that it comes back the other direction. And so we had strong growth coming out of that Great Recession. There was a 18% reduction in just that 1 year, which was a little bit different than the previous downturn. But then we had some strong growth continuing out through the entire rest of the decade. And I think it's interesting too to look at towards the end, 2017 and 2019, both represent declines. But that actually, in my mind, it was a sign of a healthy market, because what happened there was the Twin Cities became a world player. The Ryder Cup comes in 2016, and that had a huge influence in the lodging. So we had this big run up in 2016. Now, granted, it wasn't just the Ryder Cup, but that was lopped on top of an already strong economy. And then, so 2017 shows a dip. Well, it's a dip off a very, very healthy level. And then what happens is 2018, it's the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl was just an enormous financial benefit to the hotel industry, the Twin Cities and Bloomington. I mean, we hosted the two teams at JW Marriott and Radisson Blu. And so 2018 was just a phenomenal year. And so when we have this dip in 2019, it's coming off of this huge 2018 year. We had the Final Four in 2019, and that added another boost, but not to the level of the Super Bowl. But the point is that we ended that decade on a tremendously strong note, and so we're trying to forecast looking forward, and we had something like 2,100 rooms added in that decade. And so that was part of indication of the strength. And there's a term in hotel called RevPAR, revenue per available room. And that's the real key marker because it's a combination of occupancy and rate. Because you could fill up your hotel rooms, but if you give them away, there's no revenue. But, the RevPAR is kind of has them both considered. And so despite adding 2,100 rooms, our RevPAR also went up significantly through that decade. And so we end the decade, and now we have to look forward. Well, we just got done with a building boom of 5 more hotels, and we have one under construction now, the Hyatt House, right by the new fire station. And there's one other one that's gone through the approval process, Drury Inn. I think that's about 214 rooms by Minnesota Center, across from Fuddruckers. So we likely will add a couple hotels over this forecast period, like the next 4 years. However, there's also a strong likelihood that we're going to lose a few hotels to residential not redevelopment, but repurposing. So there's probably a strong likelihood that we're going to go down in net room count over the next 4 years. But I don't personally see that as a negative because the rooms that are going to be coming out of inventory are going to be the older, lower rate properties versus what's being built and what's recently been built. So, we have about 10,000 hotel rooms. It might slip a little bit, but that particular factor I don't see as a significant detriment. Okay, Kari. And then I just had those bullet points. I wanted to talk through those while the graph was on, so we can just kind of go to the next. So then with admissions now, it's sort of a similar situation. It's a 3% of the admissions sales in the city. And one thing you should know is that almost all of our admission sales occur at Mall of America. And, Nickelodeon Universe is by far the largest entity that pays admission tax. So, the fact that the mall was closed, definitely played into this, and Nickelodeon Universe is still closed. So that is working its way, into our forecasts. A couple other things I think that are interesting with that.
Excuse me, Mark. I'm going to ask a question if I may.
Sure.
On both these taxes, it's 3% collected.
Correct.
Okay, to the city. What is the room tax total? 7%?
Co-Chair Peterson, yes, that's correct.
7%.
7%.
And we get 3%. And the other 4% roughly goes.
The Convention and Visitor Bureau gets 2.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So South Loop Development Fund 2.
Okay.
And then admissions is 3 to the city. We're not talking about liquor tax in this particular presentation because that does not flow to the city general fund. That the 2%, is it 2?
It's 3% and it goes to the South Loop Capital Fund.
Lori, you're muted.
It is 3% liquor sales tax, and it goes to the South Loop Capital Improvement Fund.
So South Loop gets 2% of the hotel tax plus 2% of the liquor tax?
3%.
3%.
All of the liquor tax.
So they're the golden bear. Huh? I mean, they're collecting significant revenue in through the South Loop Development District.
That's correct.
And that is what is controlled then by the Port Authority?
Those funds are under the purview of the Port Authority, and the dedication of those funds, of those taxes to that fund is statutory.
So you, as the city manager, have absolutely no call on those two revenue streams that go to South Loop?
We cannot redirect those funds without a change in state law. We do have the ability to set up an inter-fund loan if there is a short-term need to borrow money from one fund to another, and then set up a repayment schedule. But we can't redirect any of those taxes elsewhere without the state legislature's consent.
If I follow, who wrote that law? Did we write it, or is that a state law, and we inherited it?
Chair Peterson, let me go back in history. Initially, when debt was issued for the parking ramps at MOA, those revenue sources, the 2% lodging and the 3% liquor tax, was dedicated through a closed indenture to be utilized until tax increment came in to pay for the parking ramps.
Okay.
And in 1999, there was sufficient revenues of tax increment that they were able to do a waterfall process where if it wasn't needed in that year, it could fall through to the South Loop Fund. And during the early 2000s, as that was demonstrated, we were able to pay off the debt a little bit earlier, or at least set it aside, and then we were able to redirect all those revenues to the South Loop Fund.
Okay.
Because it wasn't needed for the debt, and as it was used initially from the late 80s through the 90s.
I think it's fair to say, though, that the structure with the waterfall was set up as part of the mall financing.
Yes.
Yeah, so it dates back.
But the legislation was requested by the city of Bloomington and then approved. I presume.
I would have to do a little bit more history before answering that.
I would guess so.
Yeah.
Okay. And just to follow up, one more question on the South Loop Port Authority with that revenue stream is approved and run by the Port Authority. And so the only control the city manager has on that is the appointment of the Port Authority members. There's no string.
Mr.
No
Co-Chair
pullback string.
and committee members, the city council still controls the fund. The fund is used for Port Authority activity. So yes, the Port Authority makes decisions related to the expenditure of those funds, but ultimately the city council still has control of it. They have to approve the budget for the South Loop Development Fund every year?
The council does.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair? It might be appropriate, Mark, if it's all right with you, just staying on that same line of questions. I'm wondering if you could share with us what the overlap there might be, if any, between the authorized purposes of that South Loop Fund and the broader city purposes and general fund potentials. Or maybe some other.
Right. Let's include that as our follow-up information for next week. But as I understand the question, John, you're looking for an idea of what those dollars are used for through the South Loop Development Fund.
Well, what the limitations
Yeah.
you might be on using them. And I appreciate the
Yep.
fund loan potential, but I'm just wondering if there's also some overlap in mission between the broader city mission and authorized expenditures and the limited expenditures that other fund can.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
And I can answer at least in part that the biggest delimiter for that fund is geographic and where we can utilize those funds. And we'll provide more information then next week with the types of projects that we can fund with it.
Thank you.
Ready to move
Okay,
on?
so staying on this, I just wanted to point out a couple of things that are interesting. Given Nickelodeon Universe is such a big part of admissions, the 05-06 time frame, it was Camp Snoopy, and then it was an unbranded park called The Park at Mall of America for the years 2007 and 2008, and then there was this tremendous capital infusion and rebranding to Nickelodeon Universe. And I think it's interesting that you see 2009, there wasn't a decline. The hotel market took the huge hit in 2009, but I think it had something to do with just the newness of the rebranding of Nick Universe, and so the market, with admissions, perhaps is a little bit closer tied to housing, and there were some declines further on into the recession, and I know Matt has shown slides before of we had 6 years in a row of declining home values, and perhaps that downturn in admissions was a little bit more delayed than, not quite as tied to the economy as the hotels. But the other thing would just be to note that 2019, again, ended on a very strong note. So we were very strong coming out of 2019. Okay, Kari. So then here comes 2020. And, as I just stated, our local market was strong. The United States market was strong. The trends from 19 were continuing early on in the year. But then we started to see internationally some of the impacts from the virus, and that was quickly felt here. So Mall of America closed on March 17th. Hotel occupancies just plummeted. The restaurants closed. So it was really early on very apparent that there was going to be a major impact. So as we're meeting as a group, then we're trying to ask all these different questions. Well, what does it mean? What should we be considering? When will the Mall of America reopen? So we're forecasting this out, the summer, and we know in hindsight now that June 10th, it did reopen. But we had to ask questions about the restaurants and the bars, closed initially, and now we've got kind of a gradual reopening at lower capacities. Will the public travel? Boy, you see Delta just reported earnings or losses. It's the impact to the travel industry is just severe. And, then if people aren't traveling, are they going to stay in hotels? Who's going to stay in hotels? And we saw just, tremendous reductions in occupancy. Schools, are schools going to be normal in the fall, or are they going to be semi-normal? And schools goes from kindergarten to universities. There's issues schooling related at all ages. When are we going to reach this so-called herd immunity? The theory is that if we get 60 to 70% of the people that have had the virus, that would stop or slow the spread. And but there's so much controversy about the science, and can you get reinfected, and is that even verifiable? But it's something that we're considering. When will there be an effective treatment or even a vaccine? Boy, if we had a vaccine that the public could trust by the end of this year, that's an absolute game changer for everything, counting the assessment for 2021 and kind of all of our forward look assumptions. But, unfortunately, we're still sitting here in this time of extreme uncertainty, and it just seems, the cases are exploding again in the South and the West. I just read that Hong Kong Disney, they were a couple of months ahead of us, so they closed in January, reopened, and now just yesterday reclosed. So there's just so much uncertainty and so many opinions and so much data. Shane Rudlang, the Port Authority Administrator, just at the end of today sent us another document from the Metropolitan Airports Commission and MSP Airport, kind of talking about the impacts of travel at our airport. And, his intention is that we're going to work that data into our analysis. It's another marker that we're going to consider. So this is the plan that we came up with as a group. The first thing we want to do is document what we know. So we've got some actual data, and as that data becomes known, we're documenting it. We're planning to use 2019 data as our benchmark. So we're trying to forecast when are we going to get back to that 2019 level. The quicker the better. If we got back to 2019 soon, we would be in fine shape. As a group, we're just considering anything and everything that we can, including we have access to local Bloomington lodging performance. That certainly is strong consideration in what we do. In the forecast, then, we're trying to look at a worst case scenario, a best case scenario, and a most likely. And, of course, in the worst case, we're going to be much more conservative. Maybe we would assume Mall of America does, in fact, reclose. Best case, the medical advancements happen quicker. Most likely case is what we've presented. It will be coming up in a slide here in a second, but kind of in the middle. And then what we've done with those forecasts is we've looked to the industry. There's a lot of industry data out there, and they are pegging 2019. So they're looking out 2020, 21, 22. How are we going to be doing comparing to 2019? And so as we do our forecasting, we're doing the same thing and then comparing ourselves to that other data. And so we're going to come up with a conclusion based on the modeling that we do of how much revenue we are forecasting to lose, and that is the number that's making its way into this budget process. So this is just one small piece of the main summary page of what we're doing, and it represents the most likely scenario in our minds anyways. And just as an example of the analysis we're doing, and so this is 2020 data by month, and everything above the bold double line is actual data that we've been able to load in, and the percentages represent what is the percentage of the 2019 lodging and admissions for January. So you can see that in January we were at 100%. I mean, things were good. February, it indicates 82 and 79, but that is not an indication of the performance. It was probably closer to 100%, but there's a lag. They have a 30-day grace period from the end of the month to remit the taxes. And so the sales occurred, but a rather significant group did not submit the funds. So the February is still strong performance, but then when you get into March and especially April, you just see it falls off the cliff. And so we've got through May, and what we're doing now is just looking ahead with everything that we're considering. What do we think is going to happen? And so we are, in this most likely case scenario, we are forecasting gradual increases in occupancies, and we are in fact seeing that in the data over the last 6-10 weeks. After April being so bad, it's been a gradual comeback, but with the way things are, day by day things can change. But as of now, that's what we're seeing, and so we are forecasting this gradual return. Admissions, a little bit more pessimistic because we know Nickelodeon Universe is still closed, and it is such a big part of it. And it'll be interesting to see when it does reopen, what what the public acceptance is in terms of utilizing the facility. But then just following that through month by month, we get down to the bottom there, and so the projection is that we will lose 59% versus 2019 in lodging and 69% in admissions. And so that is the $5 million reduction in lodging tax and $1 million in admissions. And so this chart is a summary then of all of it. So we're going out through 2024, and you can see at the top, there's our forecast. So we just walked through 2020, and you see that we're forecasting a 59% reduction. And this is just lodging because this is what we have the industry markers to look to. So we receive a lot of data, and what we do is as this data becomes available, we build it into the model, and a lot of times what they track might be that RevPAR figure that I talked about, or they might track the lodging tax, which is really what we're trying to get at. One of them, I think it's Green Street, they track NOI, net operating income, so the total performance of the property. But the bottom line is that they're trying to, using their industry markers, forecast how long it's going to take to get back. And so at the bottom of the chart, it's just an average of all those different, sometimes we blend it if there's a deep and a shallow, or worst case, best case, it's just a blend. And when there's multiple dates, it's using the most recent date. But you can see that blended for 2020 is 54.4 decline. So we're just slightly more conservative generally. 2021, we're forecasting 32% versus that average of 29% decline. And so we carried that out, and it's pretty consistent. I mean, people seem to think that, 4 years out, we're going to get back to that 2019 level. And I think that kind of adds a little bit of credence to that, looking at those historical data, because if you remember, it took us 6 years out of the 2000s recession. It took 4 years out of the Great Recession. So this decline is way, way more at 59%. But people still seem to think that by 4 years out, we're going to get back there. And there's lots of negative data, but there's lots of other data to consider too. I mean, and look at the stock market. The stock market was down 30% initially, and now it's come back 20 of that and down 10. So, we're trying to consider everything in these forecasts, and it's a day by day, week by week updating, and so we'll just continue to update this.
Thank you, Mark. So just taking the forecast that Mark just shared and converting that to dollars of how that would affect the budgets. So here's the 2019 lodging tax revenue at the top there at $8.6 million. And then you can see for what we're projecting, a $5 million loss for this year. And then in the 21 budget, $2.8 million almost, 22, $1.9 million, a reduction, and then so on. And so that it would be 2024 when we'd get back to those 2019 levels. It's for lodging tax. So about 5 years to reach our pre-COVID levels. And then same thing we did here for admission tax. So, over $1 million looking at in 20, 761,000, 21. And so you can see for each the effect of that reduction and how long it would take to get back to the pre-COVID dollars. All right. So I will move on to permit revenue, if you had some things that you'd want to put up on our lodging and admission board when we have our break, if you want to write those down, or we can take some time later too, just what your thoughts are on that analysis and the approach that we're taking. If you want to jot that down, and then when we get to the end of this revenue discussion, we can put those up. Okay, so permit revenue. This is a showing the January through May of this year, the permit revenue. And the bar that goes across the middle is the 5-year average of 2016 to 2020. And what I'll point out here is 2019 is way over that 5-year average. And then 2020 is also over that 5-year average. So we just looked at the lodging and admission tax revenue, and that's a pretty dismal story there, whereas permit revenue is looking better. And then this graph is just showing 2016 to 22 permit revenues, the actual for 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. It's all trending up. And then the last 3 bars on this graph is the 2020 budget. And then what we have for the 2021 budget and the 2022 budget is a bit more conservative. So here's just some information. So for multifamily residential development, the development has increased dramatically over the last decade. So between 2000 and 2010, average of 90 new residential units per year. And then from 2011 to 2019, an average of 302 new residential units per year. And as we saw in the last graph, 2019 was a banner year. 1,068 net new residential units. And then so far in this year, 665 units are in the works. So plus another 600 units have moved through the entitlement phase and planning and zoning. Some information on single-family residential development. A small portion of Bloomington's activity is single-family residential development since we're a built-out community. And remodel permits are down 10% from last year at this time. But this is interesting with what everything's going on. Home investment seems to have picked up over the last 3 months, and residential deck permits are up 38% relative to 2019. And residential swimming pools are up 218% relative to last year.
Why not?
And then commercial industrial development. So Bloomington has a diverse mix of retail, hotel, office, and industrial. And this has led to continued development activity in previous recessions. That said, expecting little to no retail or hotel development in 21-22, but some industrial expansion still taking place. And then license revenue. So here's kind of major categories of the license revenue. So liquor licenses, the most, on and off sale, food licenses, hotel, motel, rental housing, and then there are 12 other types that make up the kind of that other category of almost, so together about 2 million. And 69% of licensing revenue comes from the hospitality industry, liquor, food, and hotels, with the largest share of that coming from liquor licenses. And licensing revenue tends to be pretty stable, and surprisingly, the pandemic doesn't seem to be having the impact you might anticipate. So here's liquor licenses, and all liquor licenses renew on July 1st. So we just completed the renewal process for those, and almost all the license holders opted to renew, and other licenses renew throughout the year on the anniversary of the initial license issuance. Next category is program income. So this is the 2020 budget of program income, and I divided them into kind of major categories just to show you what makes up this $2,057,000 part of the revenue budget for the general fund. And Public health is the most in program income, 881,000, followed by the recreation programs. There's some police programs, some of the educational programs are in there, and animal control and some other things. City clerk has in the general fund 154,000 for passport revenue, and they did split out from other parks and recreation the Creekside. That includes like the Creekside Boutique and some other programs, and then the other category. And oh yes, yes.
You're muted.
There we go. Just a couple things to note on this. The passport revenue these are budgeted amounts. This is what we anticipated we would bring in this year. Our passport operations have been closed since mid-March and have not reopened yet, so that number is going to take a significant hit. And Creekside has been closed since March, 13th, or was one of the first things we shut down. So that number we are not going to come anywhere near hitting. And the same is true with a lot of that recreation program income. It is not entirely summer-based, but it is heavily summer dependent. So most of that money would come in, I would say, in May and early June as people register their kids for summer programs, and that's not happening. So just pointing out, this is what we thought last year we would bring in this year, and we are going to be very shy in a lot of those categories.
Thank you for pointing that out, Chris.
John.
I appreciate that. And Carrie, I was just especially interested in the rec programs number because that's the bigger one. And is your gut that that's 50% or 20%, or maybe that's unfair? And I was wondering if golf was in that.
Golf is not in this because golf is not a general fund operation. We run it as an enterprise fund. I don't know what to project for recreation. I can't imagine we'd hit 50%. I would guess we're going to be closer to 20% maybe for the year, and that's dependent on how much of our fall leagues and so on we're able to actually get up and running.
So I don't want to take us in too much minutia, but I'm curious in that one, how much of an offsetting expense would there be to that in that rec category?
More than the revenue.
Okay.
So the property tax levy subsidizes those recreation programming. And so while we show this and we say that we're going to lose revenue in that area, by not hiring the staff is a main cost in running our recreation programs and some supplies. But really by not hiring the staff to run those programs, we will actually save a little bit of money.
Net.
Yeah, we'll come out net a little bit positive on a budget side. There's obviously a loss to the community when we don't run our summer programs, but financially it saves us a little bit because they don't bring in enough to cover their cost.
Thank you. So that's a nice segue into this next slide, and some things that we want to, just questions for the committee to think about and discuss to start having conversation as far as a policy issue of setting fees, and specifically for Parks and Recreation. And when the Parks and Rec Director, Ann Ketry, will be here in August and talking about just Parks and Recreation with some more detail, be talking about this more specifically. But just start this conversation about, how much of the cost of running a facility like the aquatic center or ice garden, golf, and operating programs like sports leagues, Camp Coda, et cetera, should be covered by fees collected from users. And what is the public interest in having low-cost recreation opportunities that more residents can access? And just know that Bloomington has historically kept these fees low. So they're, not covering costs, or the costs greatly outweigh the fees we're bringing in some cases. And, the outcome of that is that there's pressure on the property tax levy to support these programs, and that in current situations, often staff is stretched, and capital improvements have to be deferred. So this would be good to have kind of some of the input from the committee about how to approach this when looking at different options, scenarios. And then the last category is intergovernmental revenues, which includes grants. And I kind of have the same high-level summary of the different categories. So the majority of this intergovernmental revenue in the general fund is public health grants. That's about 1.3 million. This is in the 2020 budget. We also receive, 1.3 million. And then we receive 1.1 million from the state in police state aid for PERA, P-E-R-A, which is the Public Employee Retirement Association. And then there is some police grant revenue as well. It comes in the general fund. And then just some other intergovernmental revenues. And again, with this type of revenue, just kind of another policy issue is, the pros of having intergovernmental revenue, grant revenue is it's, new non-tax revenue. I think Jamie referred to this as one of the OPM, like other people's money. So it's definite pro if we can take off some demand on property tax. But there is some cons too. It tends to have very specific parameters, so it's not as flexible. And significant staff time can be required to identify and research and apply for grants. And then once we have the grants, it can be a heavy administrative and reporting burden to manage it, track it, and make sure everything is documented in the way it needs to be. And often they're audited later, especially if it's a significant amount of money. And then sometimes if the grant is received, it's short term, and then that funding goes away, and then there's a decision, do we stop doing the service that grant funded when that funding goes away, or does it become part of the property tax support? And just some kind of overall questions about, so that was kind of the end of this revenue presentation, giving you information, some more information, kind of what stands out to you the most. And in these different areas, if you want to comment on your half sheets, and then what other pieces of information do you need from us, from staff, that we could provide you to give you some more information as you're kind of building some, thinking about a revenue scenario for the 21 budget. So I think at this point, we were going to kind of give you a break, like if you need to get up, move around, and then if you want to, we can maybe spread out these easels a little bit more so that you can access them easily. And I'm trying to think how much time you would need. Maybe
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, so we need 10 minutes. You can write some things out. And if you need to go to the restroom or just take a break, and then from those areas, and then we'll come back and have some discussion. What's up there?
We'll restart at 7:50.
So what time was that?
7:50.
7:50. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
step out and head home, so he has joined back up on the webcast. So the WebEx. So he's still in the meeting, but not present in the room anymore. So with that, I'll call on you, Kari.
All right. So thank you for these ideas and questions up here. I'm just going to read through them, and then if any of us can answer them right now, we will. And if not, we will get back to you next week with some answers and more information. Okay. So intergovernmental revenue. This is CARES funding, the $6.9 million. Does this offset Bloomington public health expenses? And how much has been spent on COVID to date? So it's going to be used for a variety. The CARES funding is going to be used for a variety of COVID expenses. For some is public health, some is public safety, like police and fire and supplies. And there's also some of the money is going to be used for a small business loan, but we will get you the information, like detailing out everything that it's intended for and what it can be used for. And then also what has been spent to date. So that is a good question. And then for program income, the first one here is how does senior housing taxes, the percentage, is a level similar or different to single homes? So make sure I understand this. So the property taxes that would be paid for senior housing, I think, is the question. And then how is that level similar or different to single homes? Is that something that you can answer, Mark, for property tax?
Well, yeah, it would depend on the classification. If we're talking about a multifamily senior property, I mean, it's all market value based. And then the classification rate, residential is 1%, multifamily is generally 1.25%. So not a huge difference. On per unit values tend to, on the newer multifamilies, are in the 200,000 per unit type of range. So they might have a slightly higher tax rate, but I think, as we'll talk about a little bit later, single family homes, are generally much higher value. I mean, the median value home is about $286,000. So with a little bit lower rate, it would still be a higher tax. But that is certainly, I mean, I could certainly pull together, a detailed explanation of that. If I can do that, so I will actually.
Thank you, Mark. This next one says for program revenue, the city subsidizes programs. The target should be revenue neutral. And then how do Park and Rec programs impact the desirability of cities for young families? And that might just be another kind of a discussion for the group, for the committee, to think about that. And then for program income, what are the actuals to date for 2020? So we can get you that information broken out of, as Chris pointed out, what we were looking at was the 2020 budget and what it actually is.
So Kari,
Yes.
on that one, the June financial report will be ready for the city council by I think it's the 24th, 25th of end of next week, so we could share that.
Oh, yes.
This committee once the June report is done.
Yes, thank you, Lori. And this note, it says big, I think this is for Bloomington Ice Garden, high use, moderate for increase. I'm not sure if we'll put this one up here, if there's, maybe clarify what. Yep. Okay.
That was for the Bloomington Ice Garden.
Okay.
And the fees, if there's like a high use, not just for the Bloomington Ice Garden, but any like high use type facility, if it's high use, could we maybe moderately increase fees because there's more traffic coming through that type of program?
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then real estate taxes should cover these to be equitable. in regards to program income. All right. This one has the most. This is the winner. Okay, so this is lodging and admission taxes. For the long term, does Bloomington need to diversify revenues to mitigate the loss in lodging revenues? So that's a good question to consider. And how do we invest in long economic diversification? How optimistic should we be about lodging? So that's, I don't know if anyone, as I'm reading these, would you like to weigh in, Chair Peterson? Oh, are you on? Is your microphone on?
There we go. It's on now. On the first point, compared to other cities, the liquor and lodging revenue actually does represent diversification. So if you think back to that pie chart that we had up there earlier, most cities' pie chart like that would be even much more strongly dominated by property tax revenues as a proportion of revenues versus the city. So if you think about diversity, if you got a bunch of city leaders together and talked about diversity in revenues, they would say, oh, that Bloomington deal, that's a pretty good deal compared to a lot of places with respect to diversity.
Thank you, Chair Peterson. And then this one says, Bloomington should revisit the commitment to give dollars to South Loop to help all of taxpayers. So I think some more information about what the legislation says and kind of the history there. And then I think this continues. I trust the approach of forecasting room and admission for tax revenue. It's a big hole to fill. And office space will not be needed to the same numbers going forward is a point to think about. And then return to old usage norms. I think that's a question. Like, are things going to be different? I think was maybe the point about this, that maybe it's not going to come back to what we were used to in 2019. Things have changed. Chance of recovery of first quarter 2020 lodging delinquencies. And then, I see what your question is about that. So I think what Mark was talking about was some of the entities did not pay their lodging taxes when they were due, and our chances of capturing that. I will look into. We can get some information about where they're at, like how much is still delinquent, and if we're going to be receiving those. It's a good question. And then, City of Bloomington 2020-2021 budget reduction of the percentage of sales tax. Can city absorb only functions, partner? I might need some help with this one. Is this
Mr. Chair, Carrie, so what I was trying to get is the Convention and Visitors Bureau
okay.
gets, what did you say, 2% or 3%?
2% of the lodging?
of the
Yes.
sales tax. So what does that look like budget-wise? And there are 13 CVBs in the metropolitan area. So are there opportunities to consolidate marketing efforts for the area for cost savings? And is there anything, with rent and everything, are there any cost savings that the city could absorb to offset with these reductions?
Okay, thank you, Maureen, for that clarification. So for lodging, no international travel will have a negative adverse financial impacts. What's the potential impacts? So kind of some more information on that. And then the number of hotels that will close by the end of 2020 or 2021. If you want get that information. That we should be thinking about 2021 and 2022 revenues together. And then, So I think for that one, just because we're presenting projections, budgets for 2021 to also consider 2022 in total. And then hotel construction has peaked. City needs to put a moratorium on new hotel development. Want to expand on that, or?
Mr. Chair, Carrie, looking at the numbers over this last decade, there's been an increase of 2,100 hotel rooms. We're going to start seeing the real adverse impacts and the downturn in hospitality tourism. So we have built hotels, I mean, exponentially. It's been a lot of hotels being built in the city. What will happen if conventions, meetings, travel, that business transient person who comes in and pays that high hotel rate, they're not coming. And so we've got a saturated market of hotels that we are going to not have the occupancy that we need to sustain all that. So my point being, as I've been saying this for a while, we should just stop building hotels and look at other development opportunities instead.
Do you have any?
Well, I think
Anything
I
else
just, just to add on a little, I think the market is agreeing with you to a degree. If you look at, say, Drury Inn, they've had the approvals, I think, for quite some time and just haven't pulled the trigger on it. And Hyatt House was delayed, also going now, but that might be it. There might not be anything else, and like we talked about earlier, we'll probably have some come off the market.
And if I could add as well, that's, Maureen, one of the things that we pay pretty close attention to, as well as the, heads and beds, the occupancy rate. We also look at that RevPAR number. One of the concerns we had over the last couple of years is whether the development of the industry was exceeding the capacity. And judging by the RevPAR, it's not the case, because you would think with additional room availability that there would be negative pressure on rates as hotels try to compete with one another, and we didn't see that. Now, the current circumstances changed everything, but I think we are approaching that equilibrium point, and I think that this will force a natural correction in the market for a while. We have 47 hotels in the city, by the way, and just as an indicator of financial stress to those hotels, 43 of them are current on their property taxes, which is actually a little bit better than what we thought it would be.
Thank you, Jamie.
One other comment I want to make about that is that I'm glad that you brought that up, Maureen, because it's not the first time that we've had a conversation about the correct level of hotels in this city. And I can remember very early when I was on the council, which was almost 20 years ago now, we had the very same conversation about that. And that was back when the city had probably 5,500 or 6,000 hotel rooms. And the industry is 50% bigger at this point and generating the same amount of revenue per room effectively as it did back then. So one of the lessons that I learned about that is, as a elected official, trying to substitute my judgment for marketplace judgments around investing like that, I felt like it took away my kind of hubris that I could somehow be looking ahead and saying, no, that can't possibly make money from those hotels, because the hotel entrepreneurs successfully made it work.
So if I could, I'm glad you raised that. So also reflecting back at 20 years ago, and some of us painfully remember what 9/11 did for several years to the price of a hotel room, even once the occupancy went to nothing, and then gradually came up. But for 4 or 5 years, and someone should check my data here, but I think I'm right. The price of a hotel room, especially in Bloomington, was dramatically depressed. And so when things come up, these are percentage-based revenue taxes. My gut is, and it's just a gut, that we're going to really see that number lag even some of the other numbers that come up for 4 or 5 years probably.
But I think that's the data that Mark showed, was that the industry is forecasting that same impact.
Yeah, but what's different is that about 2 years after 9/11, hotels actually started getting built in Bloomington, so we had more rooms, and so the gross revenue number was increasing maybe 2, 3, 4 years after 9/11, but the revenue, we're not going to see that similar, I presume, increased number of rooms here. So we're going to see that RevPAR number probably be more relevant than it had been when it was masked, when we had more rooms year over year.
So the one thing that I've always found interesting about the hotel business is I used to think of it as kind of a zero-sum game, but a lot of times a new hotel comes in at the top of the market and it pushes hotels out the bottom. And so the model that a hotel kind of comes in and competes against people at the top is that there's oftentimes, like during periods of stress like what you're talking about, there's hotels that basically aren't invested in and become unviable on a competitive basis. And somebody new can come in at the top, and there's an economic proposition for them where they can come in and get a rate at the top where the person at the bottom can't get that same rate. So it's actually the hotel business is surprisingly nuanced, as I've learned over the last 20 years of paying attention to it. And it doesn't, you have to be very careful about how you think about it and how kind of the segmentation of the market as it represents different kinds of pools of demand, and how that matches up with the supply in the business.
Yeah.
So for licenses, this one says how to innovate franchise fees in light of Netflix and Hulu. So for the communications, our communications division, our special revenue fund.
Don't be looking at me when you read that.
Right. How do we do that? That's true. Like cable, we do have cable franchise fees, and that does go into our communications and supports that, and not enough that we also do have property tax support for our communications division. But
Kari, can I jump in there as well?
Yes.
This has been a conversation for the budget team here for the past year or so, as we've seen the trend for cord cutting in the industry. Cord cutting meaning that folks are moving away from traditional cable services. Our franchise fee that we have with Comcast, and we also had one with CenturyLink, and their service didn't last very long. The franchise is for the video services, so we don't actually get fees for the telephony or for the data. It's just for the video service. We don't have that same kind of franchise permission for all of the new entrants into the market who are providing service through Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime. And so we're seeing the franchise fees basically level off right now. Meanwhile, and actually those franchise fees very successfully funded our communications division, essentially off budget from taxpayer dollars for a good many years. And recently, both as the cost to provide service has increased, but also decisions by the city council to invest in additional communication to the community, we have seen that fund get to the point where we're now requiring taxpayer support for it in addition to the franchise fee revenue that's coming in. So that's one of those policy discussions I think that we will have as a committee, is about the communications division specifically and how we look at it for the future. Chris?
I was just going to tack on to that, Jamie, especially maybe for anybody who's watching from home. The reason we can't necessarily go out and just get revenue from these new sources is the franchise fee is basically a lease payment for using the city's right-of-way. Those are literally cabled services that are in the ground, and they couldn't do their business if they didn't have access to our publicly owned right-of-way. So they're leasing the ability to operate out of our right-of-way. The newer forms of delivering that entertainment into your home is not relying on a cable in the ground running through our right-of-way. So our ability to draw any revenue from their operations in our city just isn't there, at least in the conventional source. And the way the FCC has been talking and ruling, there's no indication that they're interested in helping preserve local government budgets. So I don't expect that that's going to grow at all. It'll more likely continue to get restricted.
Thank you, Chris. What percentage of businesses do we expect or predict to close permanently? Is that some information that we have?
It's hard to say. I mean, we don't license in any form a typical retail store, you know? So we don't draw any license fees from just your brick and mortar stores unless they need to be inspected for serving food or they have a liquor license or something. I would have predicted that our liquor license renewals would have been down and that we would have had license holders that just didn't renew their license in this environment. And as you saw on the screen, that's not the case. I think we went from 76 to 73 license holders or something of that magnitude, so a really small change. And we actually, at least one of those is in the works to come back under new ownership. So in the areas where we have sort of a good window into the operations, it's surprisingly, you know, those businesses are continuing, but it's just that segment of liquor license holders that we have a pretty decent window into what they're doing.
Maureen?
You know, I also think, Mr. Chair, I also think we're not really going to see the real impacts from COVID-19 on businesses probably until fourth quarter. The liquor license, I mean, people were able to kind of stay ahead of things, but I really think we're going to really see those impacts in fourth quarter. So I think we're going to see a fair amount of businesses that did everything they could. They got EIDL loans, they got the PPP. But if there isn't, you know, the loan forgiveness and a few other things that kind of will help these businesses through, they will be closing their doors. We just don't know the percent, but there will be. And I think we'll see more of that in fourth quarter.
All right, and then this last area for permit revenue, wondering about 2021 permit revenue, just maybe some more information about what is going into the forecasted projections for that. And then, let's see, will the in-progress multifamily or the in-works that are in the permit process materialize in 2020 and 2021? So I think, is that just a question of if we think they're going, they're kind of in process now, if they're going to go forward, actually, or the likelihood? We can get some information from community development. And then this last one is possible decrease of construction could slow down. So that could slow down, and then no permits, so then that would reduce permit revenue at that point. All right. Is there anything else you want to discuss now? I think there's a lot of things here that we can do some research, staff can, and get back to you. Or if you have additional questions, we can look at that as well. All right, are we ready for the next section? Okay.
While you're headed back up there, I'll just ask, is there, kind of based on what we've seen here, is there any reaction from folks on the committee about kind of what our opportunities or risks are around kind of revenues of these types of revenue? Any comments about that? You know, and I'll just say that if you look at the kinds of revenue, what we heard tonight, like on the program revenue, that's pretty neutral with respect to expense, because that's a fee that you're collecting for something that you're doing for somebody. So that one doesn't seem like it's a big opportunity to impact the budget. Similarly, on the permit revenue, that can't really be any higher than what it costs to deliver the service. So that's not like a moneymaker. And the licenses kind of fall into a similar category. And so really the lodging tax revenue is really the money up there that has the most flexibility on it. Other comments? John?
Sure, I think maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I think you nailed it perfectly. And by my math, that projection, the sort of optimistic projection, is about a $3.5 million hole related to just lodging and admissions. And there's no corresponding savings to that. And it begs, I think, some examination about the corollary taxes that don't go into the general fund, but from those same collections that are going into some of these other funds we mentioned, in the South Loop, and whether there's some creativity there, because to avoid some pain, it seems to me that that's a good place for us to look somehow.
All right. Okay. So the next area that we're going to look at is just the different sections of the property tax levy. So different categories and then kind of property tax impact. So this first, another pie graph here, this is our 2020 tax levy. So the total amount levied was $64,689,863. And as you can see, the majority, 90% of that is kind of in the category of operations. A large part of that for the general fund, but then also some other areas. But then there's some other pieces of the tax levy that we wanted to give you some more information about that Mark Reichel and Lori are going to share. And we have an abatement district, the Normandale Lake Abatement District, and that's a small part of the levy, or relatively. And then also the amount of the levy that we levy to pay debt service. And so just kind of a quick thing here about what makes up that amount that's for kind of the operations. $54 million is the general fund budget. That's 92.76%. And then going down in from there, the aquatics fund has like 1.2 million is for the pool and the beach, and about half of that is an amount set aside for the pool vessel replacement. So not just the daily operations, but for a big future capital a project. And then fire pension fund, which we talked a little bit about in the past. The art center fund has $1 million for a property tax levy. Golf, $300,000. Communications fund, we were just talking about that, $250,000. Taking care of getting rid of the diseased trees, like emerald ash borer, kind of forestry part. We have an amount levied for that. And then for motor vehicle fund, as those, if you recall, those fees for the motor vehicle fund are set by state statute, and we can't increase those without state doing that. And it has been requiring extra support for a while now, the form of property tax, and then ice garden. So that's the big part of the property tax levy. And then now Mark is going to talk about the Normandale Lake Tax Abatement District. Give you just some information on what that is and why it's part of our tax levy.
Okay, so a tax abatement district is a geographic area that's identified in the city, and you're seeing it on the screen in Bloomington. It's that northwest section around 84th and Normandale. And what happens in a tax abatement district is a portion of the local tax can be captured to provide some of the funding mechanism for projects needed within that abatement district. And Kari's going to have a slide that kind of talks about some of the things that are funded in this Normandale Lake Abatement District. And I think one key thing would be that it's a little bit different than a tax increment finance district, which is much more commonly talked about or a TIF district as it's referred to. A TIF district, you're capturing the entire local property tax above the base. In a abatement district, you're just capturing a portion of it, and it could be city, county, and school if you get participation from those other jurisdictions. But for our abatement district, it's city only. So, and you can see there's 8 different areas identified, and there's the developments. Some of them have multiple developments, and they're kind of spread. Like 5 is on the east and west side of Normandale. But this is just the geographic area that's in the abatement district. And so, as I was just mentioning, within our geographic boundaries, we have these 8 districts where we're capturing the city tax to help with funding of some of the infrastructure and other items that are assisting. Because we are only capturing the city tax and no other jurisdiction, it's a 20-year period that we're able to capture the tax. If another jurisdiction participated, it would be 15 years. But so for each of those 8 areas, once the development is complete and is fully assessed and fully on the tax rolls, the 20-year period starts, where we have the ability to capture the city tax portion. And there's a lot of flexibilities in these abatement districts. And when it was established, our city council decided that we're only going to capture the city tax portion above the level that existed, valuation level that existed on those properties as of 2007. So that is kind of the specifics of our abatement district. It becomes part of the total levy, like you just saw on the slide. It's not a significant part, but it's still $1 million plus or minus, a part of the levy. And in recent years, in the next slide, I'll show well, maybe you could go to the next slide. This is where we're actually calculating and forecasting what is the maximum abatement levy that we could do for each of these different 8 different areas. And what I was saying on that previous slide is that we, in recent years, have decided not to levy the entire maximum amount. So if you just look down, again, it's these new developments that have occurred in these abatement district numbered areas, and they're all familiar properties. And the abatement period column you can see it's a 20-year period commencing when it's fully assessed, and then the far right columns for 2021 and 2022, that represents a forecast of the city tax portion of the tax bill in excess of what the valuation at 2007 would have generated. And so for 2021 and 2022, it's in that $1.1 to $1.2 million range. It would be the maximum levy amount.
And so the money that is part of the tax levy that is specifically for this Normandale Lake Abatement District, the projects that have been completed so far in that district that have come through, there's a separate fund, a capital projects fund for this district, and they've done some interior street projects, urban design projects that enhance the characteristic of Normandale, kind of identifying that area. And then what's italicized here is this east, if you're familiar with the East Bush Lake Road, the I-494 more recent, the interchange, the westbound ramp project. So initially when this, the district was created, there was a thought that part of this money would help to pay for that project. And actually what happened is that basically that project, that construction project, was funded entirely from other funds. It ran through this fund, a part of it, and other funds, but it was federal, state, and county grants of $23.8 million. So then when that happened, then kind of a different look at other things that could be, the money could be used for in the abatement district for future projects. And so what the like city engineer, Julie Long, has planned out are some interior streets, additional projects, a pedestrian bridge, sidewalks and trails, a sanitary sewer project, and a water improvement project. And this slide has a history of how much has been levied specifically for the Normandale Lake abatement district since 2009. So you can see, like in 2009, $189,195. As Mark showed on the previous slide, we have an ability to set aside like 1.1 million of the tax levy for this district, but the decision was to have it at 950,000, and then that was sort of projected out, if that's correct, for the like up until 2029 when it would end. And so the total of all of that that's come in here is 6.3 million, and some of that has been spent on the on capital projects. So currently, this fund has about $5.7 million in it, and one thing that we would like to propose, city staff, is based on the planned projects for 21 to 2029, that the city engineer is comfortable with reducing the amount for the next 5 years of the levy for the Normandale Tax Abatement District. So just something for the committee to consider. And so instead of having $950,000 in 2021, we would reduce that by $650,000. So it'd be $300,000, $400,000 you can see on here, and then maybe come back up to the $950 that had been planned out up until 29. So that would have effect on the overall tax levy.
Question. Help me understand the differential between you're collecting $950 now, and the next numbers of years will only collect $350 or $650.
We are, Chair Peterson and committee members, we're proposing just $300,000.
Will be used for street and sewer and water and connections and East Bush Lake intersection and that thing. Where does the other money flow? Back into the general fund budget?
Let me answer that. We would just not levy that amount. So different than a TIF district, we have to levy each of these amounts each year, and it grows in the fund balance until we can make the improvement.
Okay.
So with the schedule that you see above me, we could still do the improvements that are needed in this district with this revised funding stream. So we would just not levy the $650,000. So that equals about 1% change in a levy. So as we're pulling all the pieces together for where the levy gets distributed to, just less would go to this area, and more could go to the general fund.
I'm still confused.
Lori, if I can help maybe. When she says we just wouldn't levy it, we wouldn't levy it under the abatement. But you could either use that so that our taxpayers pay less, or you could increase the amount that we levy for operations and the taxpayers would see no difference. There's a policy choice there about what you want to do as a result of not levying under the abatement district. But staff's estimate is that we can afford to pay for the projects that are coming down the road, even if we do smaller levies for this abatement district in the next few years, so long as we get the levies back up in some of the out years, as you see on this projection.
I'm sorry, help me. So instead of levying $58 million, we would or 950,000 of that 58 million would come back in the general assessment, and only 300 of it would be kept in the abatement district.
Now, can you go back to the pie chart?
Yep.
And it has nothing to do with those specific properties. Those
It does
apartment
not
buildings-
impact their taxes any different than it impacts any other property
Okay.
taxpayer
Okay.
in the community. What you would conceivably be doing is reducing the abatement amount that you see up here on the upper right-hand corner and making that sort of orange slice of the pie even smaller. And then you could make the blue slice of the pie a little bit bigger as one way to make up for the fact that we're losing lodging taxes and emission taxes and other things. That would be an option. Or you could reduce that orange slice of the pie and just levy less, and reduce the size of the pie by whatever amount. Staff is suggesting we go from 950 to 300,
Right.
but that's not like written in stone. You could say, oh, we don't want to cut it that close. Let's go from 950 to 400. Or you could go even further, I guess, and worry about paying for those future projects in the future.
But forgive me for being simple, Simon. There's $500,000 there, $600,000. We have a $6 or $7 million gap that we have to fill that's going to get loaded onto the homeowners of Bloomington. So I see this as a $600,000 piece that eliminates some of that levy on our homeowners to get to that 50 or 64 million.
Well, if you can take that 600,000 and put it into the blue portion of the
Okay?
pie,
Yeah?
that reduces the pressure to increase the size of the
Yeah.
pie, right?
But in my brain, we're looking at doing a levy increase of $6 or $7 million to make up this gap. And I look at this as we've just found 600,000 of it.
Yes, that's what
Is that-
staff is putting out on the table for your consideration, is here's one piece of the puzzle maybe is this $600,000.
I'm all over it.
John,
Mr. Chair, and I completely agree with what I sense is the staff's recommendation and what Neil is mentioning. So taking Neil's point and maybe raising him one, are there limitations, because there's a substantial fund balance, so to speak, based on the abatements to date. Is that money available to be used for other anticipated expenditures over the next 2 to 3 years, or is it too severely restricted or not really a fund balance?
It's really restricted. We could do an interfund loan conceivably with interest, with interest to sort of cash flow something, but the money ultimately has to get back into this abatement fund and be used for legitimate expenses in the district under state law. Right, Lori?
You are correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
other questions here? Really good questions, by the way.
All right. And so that was the end of the slides for the Normandale Lake District Abatement District. So next, debt service, and Lori Economy Scholler, our CFO, is going to talk about debt service.
Yep. So one of the very first bullets I want to make sure everyone's aware of, we are a AAA city. We have the AAA from Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, and we are one of the 40 cities out of 19,500 across the United States, municipal level, local, county level, township levels that have those 3 AAAs. So the city is very proud of those. We look at the different risks that might impact that. I have, of the 3, Standard & Poor's has an app. So we go out to the app every time we finish our CAFR, our Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and we plug our numbers in there and we look at it and confirm that next time we come up for a credit rating, we would see where our risks might be. So I am looking at, as we're COVID time, 2019 aside, what our credit ratings looking at. So we don't know yet how they're going to look at the city with where we're filling in gaps with fund balance. But just to go through what Standard & Poor's has for some of their criteria, they look at the state, our metro area, city economics. They look at the income of a median valued home person in Bloomington and see what they can afford to look at. So that would be under the state, metro, and city economics. They look at city management. Is there a lot of turnover in city council? They look at a couple of council meetings, see if there's how they're reacting. They look at executive management. If there's a lot of turnover, they look at, do we have policies and procedures, long-term financial models. So as I mentioned earlier, we give the council financial reports every month, starting with the first quarter, then April, May, June. The June report that will come out at the end of next week will have estimates of where we think we'll land to 2020. And so the credit rating gets those financial reports. They look at all that information. They look at our budget flexibility. Do we have the ability to raise taxes? Are they going to take that ability to raise taxes? If there's economic changes, are we going to cut expenditures? So when we have a conversation with them on our credit rating, we'll tell them that we deferred spending on capital and the different activities that we do there. They look at budget performance, how we budgeted and how revenues came in, how our expenditures went out. Liquidity, they'll look at our cash balances to expenditures, our cash balances to debt. Debt and contingent liability, part of that is what we're issuing, what we think we're going to be issuing, and they also look at our overlapping debt in that area. So if our school district has issued a lot of debt, if our county has issued a lot of debt, how it impacts a Bloomington's resident to pay that debt or that tax for all those areas. And then just the institutional framework in that area. No city in Minnesota gets above a strong in that area, so we continue to look at that. So those are just some of the criterias that our credit rating agencies have looked at in the past. Next slide. So on the city side, our outstanding debt at year-end 2019 was $75 million. Tax supported of that was $51.8 million. And then I break that $51.8 million down a little bit lower. In the tax supported piece, the GO and our charter bonds are $8 million.
Hey, Lori,
Yes?
you should probably explain what GO is.
General obligation bonds, where the city is pledging our ad valorem taxes to pay, we're pledging our taxes to pay for those bonds at 100% of what we issue. And then a general obligation permanent improvement revolving bonds. Those are for our payment management program for our road improvements that we annually do for road reconstruction. And taxes and assessments pay for that $43 million. In exactly, generally about 75-25. 75 being taxes, 25% being assessments. So $51 million is tax supported debt. The other pieces there of that 75 would be our utility funds or tax increment, where HRA has pledged revenues to pay for those.
I've got a question for you, going back one slide here. What's your assessment on the kind of current period collection risk on the assessments? Because the property tax would have to backfill that payment if the assessment money didn't come in.
When we looked at, Chair Peterson, when we looked at collections in May, greater than 50% of our homeowners in Bloomington have their mortgage company pick up their property taxes and their assessments and their mortgage payments. So we saw a great deal of collection of those assessments come in through that process. For those that look at their assessments in where they don't have the mortgage company pick that up, that was due today. So when we look at what we're going to get, because the county extended that period of time, so we'll get that revenue at the end of this month, and we'll see what the first half for assessments came in. So I can't really forecast how that looks. They might have been able to collect during the first half, but with COVID, the second half might be tougher to do. So we'll be watching.
And my concern about the escrow payments would be that you could easily have a situation where if you think about how escrow gets calculated in mortgages and collected, that, at least on my mortgage, the escrow basically for taxes for this year is mostly collected at this point because of the balance that gets carried in the escrow account on an annual basis. But if I stopped paying my mortgage now, the escrow account would eventually get run down by the end of the year, and you wouldn't see the impact of the lack of escrow in terms of the tax payment until next year. So it just seems to me that there could be if we saw a significant rate of mortgage delinquency in the city as we come out of this period of kind of the federal government forestalling mortgage delinquencies, that you could start having collection problems on those assessments if that represented a significant percentage of the total collections.
Chair Peterson, when we look at what the banks were doing, most of them did allow a lot of residents to do at least a 2-month forbearance. And I'm now hearing that the banks are coming back and asking if they need more time. So there may be another 2 months or 3 months that those that, depending on how they escrow it, that money for the second half of the year and the first half of next year will be telling.
Okay. And on a cash flow basis for that $43.8 million number, how much cash does that require? Like for this year, how much cash was put into that to pay off what was outstanding? Do you know?
Let's see if some of my future slides might give you some more information.
Okay, if that's on there, that'd be great.
If not, I can delve into the debt
Okay.
pretty easily.
If we shouldn't worry about it and you don't think it's going to, I'm trying to figure out if it's material or not, basically, is by asking questions. So that's really what I'm trying to, is it something we have to care about, or is it like $100,000? $100,000 is probably below in the noise of what we're doing. If it's $500,000 of risk, then we probably have to talk about it.
It could be sizable.
Yeah.
So in May, for bonds issued in 2020, we did issue $1.3 million for the Knox and American project for a future activity there. HRA is promised to pay that debt if through a land sale in the future, and we anticipate issuing about $9.2 million of general obligation permanent improvement revolving Series 24 bonds. Again, that is for our payment management program for road improvements that are happening right now. The city council normally goes through a process where in November they have a public meeting, and the roads selected for 2020 are gone through, and the council approves them road section by road section. There's a feasibility study. There's a forecast of what the cost might be. Residents receive information along the way. Generally, the first week of September, the residents will receive their letter of what their final number of that will be. And so generally on that 9.2 million, 75 will be tax supported and 25 will be assessed. And then move on. So in 2020, just to look at what our debt service obligation was for the tax supported piece, we have CIP bonds, the capital improvement bonds. So that is for the internal service fund for facilities. We'll have that conversation next week on internal service funds. So on the facility fund, they collect fees like rent from all the different departments, and it accumulates, and they pay the debt service on the center part of this building. And I would be happy to tell you that on 2/1 of 21, this building will be paid for. So it's a milestone. And then we also have a pavement management, permanent improvement revolving fund. And we've been utilizing this fund to reduce our debt levy. So we've had a reserve in there when, I'll say it again, a general obligation, a PIR bond matures. So we usually have them for a 10-year duration. when it ends and there's some cash left over, we have to put it into this revolving fund. And that's earned interest over time. And currently, we're using in 2020, $448,000 of that fund to buy down our debt. And then we issued property taxes for $5,482,000.
Lori, can I interrupt you for a second just to explain why it is that there would be money left over when we have a payment schedule for a certain number of years?
As those payments are made, people might pay off their assessment early, and it will sit in this and earn interest. And that's generally what would happen, is interest earnings on prepayments as they come in. So the levy amount last year, or for 2020, was just under $5.5 million for the tax-supported debt. So when we look at our our PI, our revolving fund, it is restricted. Again, it can only be used for street-type improvements. I can't take money out of this fund for other things unless it's for payment management program type activity. So to use it to pay down our debt, that $448,000 number that I show there in the center of that stack is one of those series of bonds that we've issued, and that's a debt service payment on one of those bonds that were for payment management in the past. So I can only use it for that. At the end of this year, we look to have about $2 million in that fund, and I would be looking to utilize another, say, $500,000 or $418,000, which would, if I add in issuing our debt in the fall of $9.2 million and what that debt service would be, I can generally keep our debt service flat, relatively flat, within a few $1,000s to what our 2020 debt service was by utilizing this fund. And that would be the intended purpose of that fund for 2021's budget. And we could probably look at that again for 2022. But then the fund, that $2 million would pretty much be gone. So this $2 million is also the safety net. So if those assessment payments don't come in, this would help make the debt service payment. So I wouldn't want to drain it too much.
Mr. Chairman?
We
Neil.
also looked at,
Neil's got a question here.
okay,
The facility fund, internal service fund, you could choose to, in 21 and 22, not to charge that to the departments and hence dropping the general fund budget by that same amount?
Chair Peterson, we've been modeling that elimination of that debt service in that collection in that fund for many years.
I know.
As we know, the bonds were paid. So when you see that fund, you'll see that that collection for the debt is gone.
So that will go away?
In that fund, yes, it will. Because the last payment will be made 2/1 of 21. So.
Lori, does that inherently mean that the charges to the departments that occupy this building will go down, or we continue to collect those charges because we have other capital needs and we need to set aside money for when this building needs a new roof and when it needs new HVAC and so on? So while it's modeled into the fund that the mortgage, for lack of a better word, will be paid off, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to stop charging those departments that money because we have a lot of other facility needs that that we coming on in the future. This is coming off, but other charges or costs are coming on.
Yep, it's just not going to be a debt issued for this building.
Mr. I know it's an occupancy cost, and I understand that. But in these critical times, the next couple of years, it might be hard to explain to some taxpayers in Bloomington that we're going to continue to accrue this occupancy cost of $700,000 for a couple of years, where we could not accrue it and therefore not have to levy as much in taxes for a couple of years. Again, times they are a-changin'.
just want
Go ahead.
comment, but
Yeah, go ahead.
if we did that, where would their emergency fund come? So what if there was like a leak all of a sudden in the roof of the building, and that cost $1.5 million that we no longer have because we decided not to use the levy? that's-
Akuya, can you use your microphone a
Oh,
little bit?
sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me? I'm sorry about that. I was just asking, what would we do in the case of an emergency? So we have like a budget for emergencies, kind of the $2 million, right? And so if we were to not issue a levy or to continue to pay or have the departments pay their occupancy tax, basically, and there was an emergency, what would we do? Because we wouldn't have the funding coming in, or technically, I suppose.
Chair Peterson, Akuya, the $2 million is in the Permanent Improvement Revolving Fund, and that can only be used for street activities. It is not allowed for this building at all.
Sorry, I was misspeaking, chairs.
Okay.
Speaking, but so whatever Carrie was talking about just a minute ago, how the departments continue to pay into a fund to, even though like the building will be paid off, they continue to pay into the fund, whichever the fund is called. Sorry, but that's what I was trying to say.
And if I look at the CI, our capital improvement plan, a replacement roof for this building is greater than $700,000. And that's coming up soon.
And so the interesting, just to comment on that a little bit, the interesting thing about like replacement funds like that is that you can change how you collect for it and say we're not going to go and collect it from the departments and not accrue for it, but it doesn't change the fact that the things that you're maintaining depreciate. Okay, and if you're, I think the historically the city hasn't replaced the 20-year roof at the 20-year mark because 20 years has gone by. They've waited until it gets to the point where, in the assessment of the staff, the cost of maintaining the roof is more than the cost of replacing it, and that's as much an art as a science in making a decision like that. But the dynamics around that decision don't change whether you decide to accrue for it or not. It's just more about whether you're being honest about what the cost is or not in doing that. And in many respects, kind of like reducing those department charges and saying, okay, we can collect less on that is roughly equivalent to just kind of borrowing money to pay for current operations, except it's much more subtle in terms of its behavior as opposed to being explicit about borrowing the money. And my personal preference on it is if we were going to go and make a decision like that, is I'd rather be upfront and honest and say this is what we're doing and have the fund actually represent what we think the costs are going to be, so that the staff is making good long-term decisions with the money as opposed to hiding stuff away. And when I was on the council, I always said, like on the street projects, that if you wanted 0 tax increases for 10 years, the place to go is to not do street maintenance. And you could go probably 10 years without putting money in the streets and no one would notice. And you could be long gone as an elected official and be out of town by the time people noticed that you weren't putting money in the streets. And then this giant bubble of street costs would come along and your successors would end up being responsible for it. Not my desire to kind of leave that sort of legacy. So, John.
Mr. Chair, I'm glad you framed that up that way. I very much agree with the transparency notion you just laid out, Steve. But it strikes me that Neil has really highlighted a core strategic question that is probably pretty useful because it's real money. And the notion I have is that this amount of money, this internal services fund amount, the let's just say $500,000, it's paying for a debt. It's paying a mortgage, if you will. That's all that's happening with that money today. When that mortgage gets paid off so if we had that leaky roof today, we'd still be paying the $500,000 or the $600,000 or whatever. It feels to me like it joins that philosophical question of sinking fund, pre-fund, pre-collect before you need it, as opposed to borrowing and over time for the length of it when you see it coming in. This does feel to me just as a real intermediate term opportunity.
And I think there's, since the situation in the 1970s, the city has steadily kind of moved in the direction of collecting resources in advance and paying for things in cash. And during times like this, I think you're right. I think there's an opportunity to, on a temporary basis, maybe recalibrate a little bit away from that direction, and saying for certain kinds of things, if it happens, maybe we'll have to borrow for a period of time in order to do it and take a little bit more risk that way in a prudent way. So I think that's one of the value judgments that we're going to end up making is part of the reason the staff, I think, is bringing this forward is to inform that conversation around, are we going to move that needle and be intentional about changing that a little bit in order to address the situation we're in today?
No, I appreciate that. And, I think about in the 70s where we had, double-digit interest rates and everything else, and looking at this moment in time, for example, the Park District on Thursday, we opened some bids on some bonds and remarkably had a rate of 0.73 on about $1.5 billion trail bond. And I'm thinking with this current, environment, maybe the sinking fund, maybe we just hold off on that. And if we do have to borrow, these are also unprecedented interest rate times in some respects. So, I guess we could go on forever, but I like how this issue is getting joined. I guess is what I'd say.
Okay. Other comments before we move on? Okay, go ahead.
So one of the options the committee could look at is making a recommendation to issue debt for the lost revenues. So two of the areas would be emergency debt certificates under the state statute. It's also in our section 7.16 of our city charter. But for these lost revenues, the two different types that are here, one has a 2-year duration or less. We can only issue for the lost principal. So, for example, if we issued for the $5 million of lost revenues for just the lodging piece, we could look at that. And I thought I had more on an example. Yeah. So we'd have to look at the different types of those two debts. We might have a credit rating risk when we look at issuing emergency bonds type of things for revenues lost. Our bond attorney said when we look at those two, we might have to do them as taxable bonds because it's more for operational activities versus capital improvement. Would the council be willing to increase the tax levy for that type of thing? So I did a quick calculation. If we issued a $5 million bond for 3 years, interest rate variation, of course, 2.5%, that would amount to about a $1.8 million tax levy that we would need to increase for this debt to pay it back. And that would be currently if we look at 1% is $650,000. That increase in the tax levy would be at 2.8 just to pay this bond. If we did a 3-year bond for the $5 million. So issuing this debt has its risks. If there's any other questions on debt, I think Kari's got more on property taxes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So,
Kari, can I just interrupt?
Yes.
Just to put a pin back in that last conversation, though. One of the questions that was asked early on was whether we can issue debt to cover the gap. And the answer is yes. But to Lori's point, there's a consequence, right? So that's that policy issue of what the necessary levy increase would be. But that tool is available if the committee wants to pursue it.
Thank you.
so just to put this information out again is, so with the 2020 total tax levy, a 1% increase is around $650,000, and then a 2% tax levy increase, almost $1.3 million, and it keeps going up by this, $646,000 number. So 3%, 1.9, and then a 4% tax levy increase would be almost $2.6 million. And then Mark Reichel is going to talk a little bit more about the city rate calculation.
Okay, thanks, Kari. And then also just how it flows into the impact on a homeowner. There's really three main factors that are going to impact the homeowner's tax. It's going to be their value. What did their value change do? The levy, which you will be making recommendations for preliminary and final levies, and what did the tax base do? And so I just wanted to just sort of walk through the mechanics. So whatever levy recommendation is approved by City Council is going to be divided by the net tax base, net tax capacity in the city to calculate the city rate. That net tax capacity, so it floats a little bit. It's not locked down. I mean, there's a net tax capacity that's going to be used for truth in taxation, the proposed property tax statements. Then as time goes on, around December 1st, the tax base becomes final, so that by the time the final levy is approved in the December timeframe, you have that final net tax base number. Now, likely won't move significantly, but it could. But just to kind of walk through the math on how this gets to the impact on the homeowner. So for Pay 21, which would be the January 2020 assessment, after all the adjustments are done for legislation and adjustments, fiscal disparities, and tax increment, you're left with the net tax base up 2.3%. So with that tax base up 2.3%, that in effect drives the city rate down 2.3%. So the math would be, if it's a flat levy, the rate part of the impact would be minus 2.3% based on tax base increase. And then you have to kind of couple that with the value change. And the next slide, and you've seen this before, but for Pay 21, market values on the median value home didn't move that much. The previous year, we were up more in the 10% range. But so for Pay 21, market value and taxable value has some other nuances because of the homestead exclusion. But the fact that the market value didn't go up that much, the exclusion amount didn't change much either. So it's essentially a 1% value change for the homeowner. And on the next slide, we can see for these various options that are on here, what that impact might be. So for Pay 2020, the final levy approved was 4.75%, and that resulted in the city tax on a monthly basis of $89.73 on the median value home. And then with these various levy scenarios, I just walked through at the flat levy, so the 0% levy, we mentioned the rate would go down 2.3%, but the value went up 1%. So the net change at that flat levy is actually a reduction to the median value home of 1.3%. And then the math just falls to the point where, you get to, if it was a 4% levy increase, the rate would go up a little bit because the tax base only increased 2.3. And so you do that math, couple in the 1% value growth, and even at that 4% levy for 2021, the change to the median value home would be about 3%. And here,
Kari, can you go back? Slide. So just to you know, if we look at that dollar change, that drop of $1.21 is a per month piece. So if you wanted to calculate out that out by 12, you would see that, you know, if we had a 0%, the median valued home would have a drop of about $12, $12 to $15. And if we look at the 4% on an annual basis, it's about $31 to the median valued home is what the dollar impact at the 4%.
I've got a question here. You know, you talked in a previous presentation about starting to look more at apartment in addition to homes. Are you planning to have produce a similar number for apartment for next year?
I can do that. I mean, just speaking off the top of my head, you know, the rate itself, the city rate would be the same.
Yep.
But with the classification systems and whatnot, the tax capacity is a little bit higher, but the value change on apartments continued to be strong on the 20 assessment, and so I think the net was about a 5.6% increase on average. The inflationary change on apartments, the total change was much higher due to new construction, but if you're just looking at the inflationary, so if it would probably be something in the neighborhood of 4% higher on the apartment, you know, due to value growth being higher. But I can do that for apartments, certainly.
Yeah, that'd be great. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I was also just going to add, when you're looking at this chart, as Lori said, you would multiply that dollar change by 12. You also want to keep in mind we're not the only entity on the tax bill. So this is what would happen to somebody's city tax. And then depending on what the Hennepin County Board decides and the Bloomington Public School Board and so on, you know, it's probably reasonable to assume that those entities are experiencing budget challenges similar to or possibly even greater than the city of Bloomington's. And they may be looking to their levy as well to conceivably solve a portion of their challenges. So keep in mind that that's not the total the homeowner might see on their bill, because what they see on their bill is going to be a combination of all of the jurisdictions that have taxing power for that parcel.
And then this slide just gives a little historical perspective on what's happened to the median value home tax, you know, over the last 5 or 6 years. You know, the property tax system is very complicated, and each one of these years has factors, you know, impacting what was the value change for the home relative to the tax base in total. There's legislative impacts towards the tax base. You know, the biggest one that sticks out is 2017, and the drop, you know, despite a levy increase of 5.75, the net tax base in the city went up 15%. 10% of that, or 2/3 of that, was due to the Mall of America Phase 1 TIF district expiring. So that's just an example of you know, the legislative impact. So there's a story to each one of these years, but you can see that generally it's moved up a little bit over the past 3 years.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Neil.
And that's, Mark, you're just talking the city portion only again. Yeah.
Chair Peterson, yes,
1/3.
that's correct, and that's a good point that Chris made. That, you know, with the home here, we're talking about 30% of the tax bill. So, you know, I would say Bloomington Public Schools, basically share our tax base. I mean, it's almost, I think 98% of Bloomington's tax base is Bloomington Public Schools. So they are impacted in a similar manner. The county, we make up about 10% of the county tax base. So things such as Mall of America coming out of TIF, it benefited the county portion as well, but not nearly to the degree of the city of Bloomington or Bloomington Public Schools.
Mr. Chair, just
John?
to put that into context, so if I read this right, the property tax on the average on this median family home over the last 3 years, when you look at the county and the city and the school districts, roughly $350 increase over 3 years ago. Is that roughly correct?
I didn't do the math, but yeah, yes. If you just added up the annual changes.
Thanks.
Oh, that's right. There's two for 2020. And as we move on the slides, I mean, we are going to show, we do compare ourselves to the competing cities in the area, just so you can get some sense of the relative value.
Yeah. I was just trying to get my head around the median home, and then later on in this process, I suspect, building on what Grace was really encouraging us to think about, it's probably worth looking at the profile of that home, where it is, how long perhaps what the price was when somebody bought that home, and perhaps who's residing in that median family home, and maybe at that point we'll really be able to see the impact on individuals and groups, seems to me. So that's why I was locked in on so it's a $350 basically annual is $350 increase over the last 3 years for the property tax for that median value home.
You're adding two numbers there.
No, I'm not. No. If you add 104 and 33 and 83, and figure that's about
$200.
You see what that gets to, and then, I mean, maybe it's more than that, because I guess if we're only a third, of the overall, I guess maybe it's more like $600 for the average or the median family home.
Mm-hmm.
It depends, Mr. Chair and members, on how the school district and the county changed their levy. They
it
may
sure
or may
does.
not have changed their levy to the same
Yep.
extent that the city did. They might have done a larger levy increase or a smaller levy increase than the city did.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But roughly speaking, it's been about a third.
Chair, I just have a question, sorry, excuse me, about, I guess delinquency. So if homeowners are unable to pay this most recent property tax due date, I was looking at the Hennepin County one, they had like a forgiveness period from May to July or whatnot. Do we offer anything like that in the city or no? And then if we do, can we control what we fine people or how we like charge the fine to homeowners? Does that make sense?
The members in Aquia, the county collects our property tax, so we don't. Yep. So we don't have any say on when it's collected or any penalty that would be assigned to the property taxpayer is done by the county.
Okay.
One other thing to point out in here that doesn't get accounted for in this, but in people's kind of net kind of basis here, is there's also the property tax refund program. So after the city does this assessment, there's a process where people based on their income can go and get a refund for part or all of the property tax that's assessed on their property, depending on their income level. And so the impact of that is really hard to measure in this process, because the we don't really, there's no, the median house is kind of a mythical thing because it's, you know, but if we go look at average household incomes in the city and compare it to the state's rules around the property tax refund, you can get a sense of who would qualify if they had kind of a median income for that refund. So that's one of the things to think about when you're kind of comparing the bill to other bills, is that for a lot of people in the city, this amount is kind of a gross amount that has to have that refund netted off of it in order to determine what the actual net cost was.
You know, I think that's a great point, and you know, Matt tutored us on that a couple of weeks back, and it strikes me as we're thinking about, well, what would we present to the public to react to?
Mm-hmm.
It might well be worth, you know, articulating what that median home value is in the city, and then it would be easy enough to figure out what the average household income is.
Mm-hmm.
And it would, once you have those two numbers, be pretty easy to figure out how we could apply that income tax credit against, or how an individual that fit that prototypical average, you know, could apply that income tax credit against the property tax and really lay those numbers out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Chairs Peterson and John, I believe we do have a slide that gets to what you're talking about for the median value home, and it doesn't identify the income level that I think what you're trying to identify. It just gives the range of incomes and what share of the property tax could be refunded based on that income. But what I'm hearing is that you'd like to see what, say, a Bloomington typical homeowner income would be to try to focus it more.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to go crazy with gymnastics about all this stuff, but just, I think, bringing some reality into, okay, over the last 3 years, you know, what's the average tax bill done? What do a couple of scenarios possibly do to an average tax bill? And against that backdrop, perhaps, what are ways that burden, if it's a burden, could get mitigated, like that program, and just simplify it. No, I wouldn't. You can go crazy with these kinds of things. Right? I wasn't taking us down that path.
And then just to continue, as I mentioned, we do calculate monthly cost of the city portion of the monthly cost for several communities, kind of our competing set. So you see Bloomington's $89.73 for the property tax portion. And then we've also considered some of the other typical monthly costs that may or may not be paid for through taxes, and added things for, you know, franchise fees and water softening and sewer. So kind of that all-in monthly cost is $148 for Bloomington. So, you know, a good value relative to these other communities. And, you know, I appreciate, too, the comment that Chair Peterson mentioned, you know, just regarding, I think it was the kind of the infrastructure needs in the city. I mean, we're not a new city by any means. You know, we have significant infrastructure needs on an ongoing basis, and I think that's an important thing to remember. If looking to some of the newer communities, perhaps they're not as far down the line as far as needing the pipes, and, you know, maybe the streets and roads are newer. Bridges, I know bridges are a tremendous expense. So, I mean, as a resident myself too, I think that this is, you know, indicative of a good value for the median value homeowner. And this, like, just another way of of showing the same data, just in a bar graph format.
And thank you very much, Mark. So just for this section, some additional discussion questions if you haven't thought of yet. Just we're very interested just to get the committee's input on their thoughts on reducing the Normandale Lake Abatement District 2021 amount from $950,000 to $300,000. So as we said, that would be a $650,000 reduction to the tax levy, or that portion. And just kind of your thoughts after seeing this information on options for a preliminary tax levy increase, and thoughts on issuing debt for lost revenues, as Lori went over, and just additional questions that you have about the property tax levy. So, so our thought, what we had planned to do is we have, again, kind of the same activity where we have something for levy to pay off debt, and your thoughts on that, homeowner costs, and then the abatement district. And underneath that, we have, kind of levy now to build up cash for projects later. Kind of that's kind of theme for that. So if we wanted to kind of do the same exercise, I don't know how much time you'd like for this. And then we'll just do the same thing where we go over those.
So let's just, on this one, let's just do 5 minutes and not do a
5
big
minutes?
break
Okay.
here. Yeah.
All right, that sounds good.
Yep.
All right, thank you, everyone. So this first one, levy to pay off debt. Here we have levy 4%. This one says, do not consider, what does this say? Do not consider options of using debt, for lost revenue. Too much negative impacts. Prepare to issue 3-year lost revenue debt to minimize increase levy on homeowners. Borrow $5 million reserve and then cut the assessment levy. And this is for the abatement district. So I think suggestion to use the abatement district, as Chris had explained, that has to be ultimately used for that inside the abatement district, but to do like an interfund loan is a suggestion. And then no debt for lost revenues. Okay. Is there anything anyone else wants to add about any of those or clarify or add to? Okay. And then on the homeowner cost topic, focus on the impact on a fixed income and also racial and economically disadvantaged is worth the effort to do that focus. Need to keep the options open. People expect their taxes to go up. When do we know what the county and school district plan on doing for the total effect of the homeowner? When do we know that, Mark?
Well, they're on the same schedule, so by September 30th, they're going to need to provide preliminary levies, and oftentimes it'll be published in the newspapers, and we're able to see what their levy proposal is, and we know what their tax base is. So it's probably by mid-November or mid-October at the latest, we would be able to give you a ballpark estimate. The truth in taxation statement won't come out till mid-November.
Okay.
Just to talk about the practicalities of that, is that for the city's decision on the preliminary levy, we won't know what the other districts are doing. We've got to make our own decision on that. Then once kind of everybody lays their card down at the same time, then we know what card they laid down. But then when it comes to the final number, the same thing happens basically at that point. So you really don't, you can't say, well, like they're doing this and we're going to do that. That game doesn't end up working. You got to make your own independent decision at each stage.
We need to learn more. At this point, I don't agree with an increase in the tax levy. To make up a $5 million deficit will require a levy increase of 4%. I think I've got everything on that one. And then for the abatement, the Normandale Lake District, this says yes. I think that the proposal that we have, you're agreeing with that. Let's do it. The flexibility is worth it. I agree with the reduction in the abatement, agree with the recommendation, and agree to reduce the Normandale Lake abatement to $300,000. So we have consensus, I think, on this option. So success. Anything else that anyone would want to add to this discussion now? Or I think we have some things, especially from our last round, of information to get back to you. Mm-hmm. So,
Kari and Chair Peterson's on a simple calculation of a $5 million divided by 650,000 as a 1% type of thing, the levy would need to be 7.7% to fill the gap of the $5 million.
Lori, what would that be?
The impact if we were to levy for the whole gap. How about we provide that in our follow-up for next Wednesday? I didn't want to be presumptuous and model that number. So,
and I think that's an important question to ask, because we're gonna, if you think come back to the 3 deliverables that we have a first deliverable is to set a proposal for a preliminary levy. We're not on that particular one, we're not asked to provide a range of choices. We're going to make a single recommendation that we think this is what the council ought to select as the preliminary levy number. And that necessarily, from a kind of revenue side of things, is going to be the top choice that we're going to have. And not top in terms of preferred, but top in terms of generating the most revenue, having the highest tax level. So over the next couple meetings, I think we'll be circling back, getting more information and having a little bit more of a conversation on that. But probably by the middle of August, we need to have a consensus on this group on what we're going to go and take back to the council and recommend to them around that number. And it's not going to be a number necessarily that's going to be based completely on looking at all of the expense side of things yet. I think it's what we're doing is we're saying we're coming and saying that this is where we think the maximum number is. And that conversation is going to occur in conjunction with some of the expense numbers that we have over the next couple of meetings.
Okay, thank you.
So was that it on the presentation? Anything else that was in there for tonight? Or?
Yes, that is all we have on the agenda.
Okay. Any other questions on this particular topic before we wrap up that topic for the evening?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Neil.
Just comment. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I think we owe the staff for the vote of appreciation because we're starting to get down to the nitty gritty now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next thing is kind of a reflection at the end here, kind of process-wise. I think we're making good progress. I think we're starting to see people thinking in more concrete detail around this levy question, and there have been some really good questions around that I think we'll be able to get answers to and have a good conversation in time for us to make that decision. But I want to get other people's feedback on where we're at this point. Seeing a nod. John, go ahead.
Well, I think
You come up to the microphone, John, so people can hear you.
I think you bring up a good point that whatever we agree on for a number is the ceiling number, and the council can only go down from it.
Yeah.
And my sense is that on the levy number, some of us were thinking we'll do most of our debt adjustment through the levy. But as we learn more about other possibilities, that could, well, let's see, how do I put this? Could we as a committee say, maybe at the end of September, say, you know, this was the number we suggested, but now that we've got more information, we're saying that maybe we're going to do 2 or 3 other options to knock that levy number down.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. Yeah. And, you know, as somebody who had to, 14 times had to go and vote to pick that preliminary levy number, and knowing that you're picking, you're doing the high card, not the low card on that. And Neil, I don't remember how many times you ended up doing that. That can be a difficult conversation because you're deliberately picking kind of a maximum on things. And so I think we need to be ready for saying this is going to be kind of the limit on our high thing. We hope that we're not actually delivering on that particular one, or that the council necessarily has to pick that, but that we're picking a number that's the maximum number, and that we've got room to work underneath it, to John's point about looking at alternatives to make sure that we keep that number as reasonable as possible in the choices that we make. Other input? Akia?
I just have a quick question,
Yeah.
Chair Peterson. Jimmy, you mentioned last week, but I don't have my notes. What was our estimate last year for September, and then what did we go down to? Was it 4.5%? What did it start at?
I can answer that, chairs and Akuya. So the preliminary tax levy increase last year was set at 6%, and then the final came down to 4.75% increase.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions or reflections on tonight's discussions? Okay, was there anything else from the staff for this evening? Seeing head shakes from the staff. Anything else from the committee? Hearing nothing else, the meeting stands adjourned.